Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into tackling mass incarceration with a focus on prison reform and human rights.
Joining us now is Tajuana Johnson and Kwesi Dash, lead attorneys at the Alliance of Families for Justice. Welcome, and let's get to it. Please introduce yourself and let us know what brought you into prison reform work.
Thank you for having us. I'm Kwesi Dash. I'm one of the lead attorneys at the Alliance of Families for Justice. I have always been a public interest lawyer since graduating law school. I worked for the Department of Corrections in their law library unit for a number of years. And then I went to the Legal Aid Society, where I was a public defender for about a decade, in the parole revocation defense unit, then in the Manhattan trial office, felony misdemeanor practice, trial practice, and in the community justice unit before starting at the Alliance of Families for Justice. So it's sort of a trajectory that has brought me here.
Good morning, I'm Tajuana Johnson, and I started out as a public defender, just like Kwesi. I was with the Legal Aid Society for a little over a decade. After that, I went to CUNY School of Law, where I taught in the criminal defense clinic for a semester. And then after that, with Kwesi's assistance, launched the legal support unit at the Alliance of Families for Justice. So that's how we came to this point.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, can you talk a little bit more about what the Alliance actually does?
The Alliance of Families for Justice is a nonprofit organization that supports families of incarcerated people as well as their incarcerated loved ones. It's an empowerment organization. Tajuana doesn't like that word, but that's the word that it's in the mission statement. But essentially the idea is that families should have a say in the things that happen on a policy level to their loved ones while they're incarcerated. So the organization provides emotional support for families, but more importantly, it engages them in the political process. Families lobby about various issues in Albany, things that have to do with visitation, packages, the receipt of packages in prison, and transportation to see loved ones, the state's ability to limit that, things of that nature. There is a family support unit. I mentioned that they provide emotional support. There's a forensic social worker that heads that unit. There are support groups. There is a family circle every Tuesday. And Tajuana and I lead the legal support unit. And we deal with all the legal issues that we'll be discussing today.
And the legal support unit is the legal arm of the Alliance of Families for Justice. It was launched in January of 2019, so we're coming up on a year. Kwesi and I launched the unit and sort of built it to where it is now. The legal support unit handles several different issues, and they're twofold. Because the Alliance of Families for Justice is a family organization, we represent family members of the incarcerated loved ones. So, for example, if someone's visiting a family member at one of the correctional facilities here in New York State, and the visitation is revoked for a number of reasons by the DOCS, which is the Department of Corrections, what will happen, and community supervision, what will happen is those visits will be stopped. At some point, the families look for advocates to help them move through the process of getting the visits restored. So we work with them on getting the visits restored or getting to the bottom of why the visits were, in a lot of cases, arbitrarily revoked, the permission to visit their loved one. The other side of what we do is we represent their incarcerated loved ones. And our cases range from what we like to call human rights abuses. So they range from physical abuse to medical neglect to a long time in the solitary confinement, which is the SHU portion of the correctional facility, for sometimes arbitrary reasons or for too long a period of time. And we also represent one or two clients, unfortunately, who have been sexually abused by doc staff. Yes.
So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation today, especially because I feel like over this last year there's been so much discussion about criminal justice reform and then figuring out how that plays a role when we're starting to look at our jails and our prisons.
Yes.
So for the two of you, I mean, what made you decide that becoming attorneys and using the law as a way to be able to advocate for change? Like, what made you decide to do that?
I think the larger answer to that question is personal experience, coming from the communities that we represent and recognizing the need to advocate for folks that come from those communities. I actually, almost ashamed to say this now, but my goal in going to law school was to just make money and take myself out of my circumstances. And I ended up interning during law school, internships on Rikers Island because it was one of the few paid internships. And that experience opened my eyes. We know about the demographics, about people that are incarcerated, but seeing it and being in it and a part of it as an employee just turned my entire perspective around. One of the things that we thought would be a good transition in coming to AFJ, the Alliance of Families for Justice, is it seemed to be the next logical step from the work that we were doing as public defenders. And we thought that we had an idea of what happened to people once they went to prison. Like most people think that they know, either from watching television and movies or from having some sort of experience representing people that are charged with crimes. But what we uncovered was a lot more than we even imagined in terms of what people are experiencing. And what we often say is that folks may have differing perspectives about crime and punishment and mass incarceration. But when it comes to basic human rights and human dignity, most of us are on the same page. And the work that we do has to do with human rights and not necessarily about whether people should be incarcerated in the numbers and demographics that they are, which is problematic. But our work really has to do with the conditions of their confinement.
Yeah. For me, similarly to Kwesi's experience, it was personal experiences that led me to become a public defender, and then the next logical step would have been, I believe, prison reform. Having been a school teacher for a while, I taught special education students when I was younger. And what I didn't know then that I know now is that jails were being built based on the information that I was providing on these little bubble sheets about my students. And so once I started to realize that, then I started to look back and try to uncover what some of them were doing. And unfortunately—
Can you explain that a little bit more? So you're saying that you're filling out bubbles and then that was being able to use—
So, not to date myself, but I taught a long time ago, primarily in the late 90s and early 2000s. Back then, there was an individualized education program. Is something that's created for every child that's in special education. Mm-hmm. So presently, I believe the form is a little more nuanced in that you get to write certain things in and give a real description of the child and their needs and concerns about their progression. Back then, in the old days, it was simply a bubble sheet. And so you had like 4 or 5 different options that you could choose. And what I learned was that those bubble sheets and the information that I included in those bubble sheets were being tallied based on my answers, and that beds and prisons were being built with the anticipation that these young men that I was teaching at the time would ultimately land in prison. And so when I went to look back, unfortunately some of them had. So I moved from teaching to becoming a public defender because of that experience and my own experiences growing up. I grew up in a New York City housing project, and you can imagine the amount of police presence and arrests that took place there. And so actually went to law school not really understanding the difference between a public defender and a district attorney, seeming to think that somehow, based on what I had saw, both people played on the same team. Went to law school like Kwesi with other ideas and other plans, wound up at the Legal Aid Society representing juveniles initially because of the natural trajectory from teaching the students to now representing them, and then moved into representing adults. Oftentimes what happens when you are a public defender, there are a lot of cases. You stand up, you fight, you put everything you got out there. Sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. When you lose and your client is sentenced, it's a very tragic situation. Family members are there, you console them, you talk to your client about keeping in touch, and you try. You honestly do. You try if you're committed to the work the way we are. But what happens when they sort of move through that rabbit hole of prison is something that I was not familiar with. Even though I stood in court with them, and even though I tried to keep in touch with them, the work that we do now reveals that there is a horror show happening in the mountains of New York State, wherein the mountains serve as a sort of tapestry to hide what's really going on in a very, what we like to call an extrajudicial kangaroo court.
Yeah, and if I can interject really
Absolutely.
quickly. So, you know, what you're saying, I think more and more people actually have more exposure to it, particularly when we're talking about the prison industrial complex,
Yes.
right? So mass incarceration over several years, and now it seems like, you know, the communities are really speaking out because now people understand what's happening. So I think what our audience would be interested in knowing is, so how does your work fit into the reform paradigm? Because now people want to see prison reform.
Right, right.
Well, the first part of, that's an excellent question. The first part of your question, though, sort of calls for a little bit of explanation. So there are 54 prisons in New York, and about 48,000 people that are incarcerated. The majority of those people are people of color, and the majority of those people of color come from approximately 7 distinct communities in New York City, right?
Wow.
Yeah.
So they're incarcerated in very remote parts of the state, where their custodians, for lack of a better word, are people with different experiences, people that do not look like them. And as a result, there's a whole cultural system that is in place to sort of funnel folks through that system, and their conditions are less than humane, right?
Yes.
So what we have discovered, which is why we mentioned, given our experience, thinking that we knew what happened, is that most people don't recognize the extent to which abuses are taking place in prison.
Absolutely.
And that's because there's such a stigma attached to being incarcerated,
Right.
that most people who themselves are incarcerated think that being beaten, being starved, being referred to by racial derogatory terms, being sexually assaulted, just come with being locked up.
Right.
And so there's this sort of persecution, self-imposed persecution complex that's at play, because there's a stigma attached to being incarcerated, and a lot of people don't feel empowered to even report things that are happening. So as attorneys,
Right.
starting to take on these cases, and I'm getting to the reform part,
Yeah.
that was a revelation even to us, who are veteran public defense practitioners. So given this sort of pandemic or epidemic that we have now been exposed to, and there are not a lot of lawyers that are driving upstate and visiting clients. There are not a lot of lawyers that are doing that, and certainly not lawyers that look like us.
Right.
We spent a lot of time thinking about how to address that. And aside from the legal work that we actually do case by case in addressing these issues, which we can talk about in a moment, we think that transparency is an initial step in sort of uncovering what's happening in prisons. And we believe that that transparency has to be legislatively mandated. So aside from the cases that we take on, and we have since January approximately 60 families and 60 cases that we are working on, we're also working on a policy piece to bring about mandated transparency and accountability when prison staff abuses people that are incarcerated.
So specifically when you're saying mandated transparency, like what does that look like? Because I feel like most people probably agree that transparency is important, but I imagine like the devil's in the details. So what would you look at as a transparent, effective way of making sure that, responding to complaints from folks?
Well, what happens when we go to visit our clients, even as attorneys, we meet them in a visiting area. Sometimes the area is closed off, and sometimes it's in a larger visiting area, and we just have like a particular corner. So even as attorneys, we have a limited ability to really see what's happening on the inside. And while we're there and we're talking to our clients, oftentimes there are a room full of correctional staff sort of standing around and intimidating our clients from being sort of really truthful about what's happening for fear of retaliation. And so when we started to get some of these horror stories from them, and it took some time, what we realized is people don't know. And we really have to stress that because we've sat down a million times, well, not a million times, it feels like a million times, with people, practitioners, government officials, and they're like, yeah, prison, we get it. I had several family members spend long periods of time in prison. Family visited them, very close to them, my own biological family, and had no clue. Even upon them returning home, still really didn't understand the issues that they were facing. And so what transparency looks like, to sort of get to the real meat and bones of it, is blowing the top off of what's happening, essentially allowing for people to get inside, media, elected officials, family members to be a part of the process to determine who works there and what goes on there, and also be able to have more than just report back, right? More than just, these are numbers, we're a watchdog organization, we've gone in, we've got this information, we're bringing it back. But to be able to essentially open up the doors. There should be an opportunity for lawyers to go in and sit in a cell with their client and understand what's happening day to day without the intimidation of the staff sort of regulating how it happens and where it happens. And there needs to be accountability for the behavior. What we're seeing now is, while it's a sort of slow roll, we're seeing police officers being held to some degree accountable, or at least the community saying they should be held to some degree of accountability. We want the same for correctional staff that have committed horrible and atrocious acts against our clients. And so that's a bit about what the transparency and accountability piece will look like. And we're continuing to develop it. We have some more ideas and some more people that are working with us on it.
And so what can communities do to support some of these initiatives? I mean, you named a lot, and I'm sure there's probably a list of 200 things that people can be doing to kind of support the work that you're doing. But if you could potentially drill it down to, let's say, 3 or 4, for example, that could cause a very strong ripple effect in this area, what would you say that some of those things are?
So presence is a big thing. One of the barriers to transparency is the fact that most of these facilities are so remote. One of the things that we do as part of our work is travel every 4 to 6 weeks to visit our clients, and we have to prioritize the most egregious cases. The longest of those trips is to upstate and Bear Hill facilities, which are about 20 minutes outside of Canada. So it's a 6 or 7 hour drive. Now, if you think about family members making that trip, it creates difficulties for them. However, part of why these abuses continue and are so prevalent is because people are just isolated from the rest of the community. So one of the things that AFJ does is encourages family members to go in groups We connect with people in communities that are close to where those prisons are located, and they check in on our clients. Sometimes one or two people, I might come to you and say, your brother called me. He was concerned about you. We heard that you were beaten up by 4 COs last week, which is a regular thing.
Right.
So we
COs
just
would be corrections officers.
COs, I'm sorry, yes, correction officers. And we're just here to check on you. It might be trying to locate, which is a big part of our work, where someone is after they've been injured. Because part of why transparency is important is families have a hard time finding out what has happened to their loved ones. In recent cases that I think of people dying in prison, some of which we are familiar with, one of the big issues is that families don't know for days, sometimes weeks, if their loved one is alive or dead, right. And if they know that they have died or passed away, then they have no information about how that happened, right? So we encourage community members to be present, speak to your local representatives, especially the ones that have connections to those parts of the state. Like I said, there are 54 prisons, so there are prisons in every corner of New York. And there are representatives, some that might be less open than others, but nonetheless representatives that can be brought to task about what is happening to their constituents and the people that live in the regions that they represent while they're there. AFJ, the Alliance of Families for Justice, we have a website. We welcome families to participate in lobbying and thinking about different types of legislation.
And can you say the website as well?
It is afj-ny.org.
Yes.
And this is a good plug moment for us.
That's right.
We have Instagram, just the two of us. We're Thorough Borough Barristers. I'm not going to spell that. It's just, at Thorough Borough Barristers, THOROUGH, BOROUGH, BARRISTERS. That's on Instagram and Twitter.
Yes.
And we have our own sort of social media presence just to bring some recognition and awareness to the things that are happening. And so we always encourage members of the community to reach out to us. We're always in the community talking about this and making ourselves available to family members and members of the community that want to participate. But it's in thinking of and drafting legislation, participating with the organization, and being present at the facilities, preferably in groups, are some of the ways that people can be involved.
And definitely getting involved with AFJ. We can't stress that enough. AFJ is the only organization in the state that currently does this particular kind of work, engaging family members and the community in being movers and shakers for prison reform and to combat these human rights violations that are taking place.
So just quickly, so let's say someone's watching this show right now, and maybe they have a family member or a friend who is incarcerated, and they feel like there's been some type of human rights violations they're told, whether it's solitary confinement or for too long, or not getting meals, or a number of the other things that you had mentioned earlier. What's the process? What should that person tell either that justice-involved individual to do so that they can be able to, have their, essentially enforce their rights?
Well, there are 3 different ways that they can contact us. There's the incarcerated loved one who can contact us directly via mail, right? And our address is the Alliance of Families for Justice, 8 West 126th Street, New York, New York, 10027.
I'm sorry. But just quickly, but even outside or just Alliance, or just let's say, what is the process for anyone who's bringing it? Yeah. Okay,
right?
great. Yeah,
there's a grievance process.
Right.
And so the ultimate remedy in our work is suing the state
right.
for injuries sustained, sometimes wrongful death, all of these abuses, that's our ultimate remedy. We're a nonprofit, so we're not suing for money. Well, we're suing the state for money, but it's not for our personal benefit.
Right.
It goes back into the organization to fund our work because we're privately funded, because we're suing the state, so we don't take state funds. And it goes to the families as well for some measure of recompense, right? But there's a grievance process, and we always encourage folks that are incarcerated that have been abused to grieve it. Now, there are all kinds of consequences for that, unfortunately,
Right.
but there's no other remedy that you can seek in terms of suing the state unless you go through that grievance process. So filing a grievance is the first step that families should advise their loved ones. And reach out to us or other organizations. That we're the only organization that does this particular kind of work.
Right.
But there should be other people that are made aware of this, because there's a lot of retaliation for incarcerated people filing grievances. And it's just important that people are aware that something has happened to my loved one, and I've encouraged them to file a grievance so that the eyes are on the facility.
And we can walk people through the grievance process. We can walk them through the process, and sometimes what happens is while they're going through the grievance process, if they contact us, we can just go out and do a wellness check, a wellness visit. And what that sometimes does is it signals to the staff there or the folks who have essentially been involved in whatever the human rights violation is that now somebody's looking, somebody's paying attention. For me, it's always these mountains that are just hiding all of this stuff. And so to be able to travel through these mountains and get to the other side and sit down with our clients sometimes, a lot of times, sends a message, and that can sort of help them get through the grievance process without the retaliation that sometimes comes along with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then after the grievance, if that doesn't work, is there another portion to it?
So after the grievance process, then you sue the state. There are 1983 claims that can be filed, and there's state and federal constitutional claims that can be filed for human rights abuses. I won't bore you with the particulars, but those are the remedies. However, you have to go through the internal grievance process first, or else those claims won't be viable. So a lot of the work that we do is entails walking individuals through that process, and the process takes months. I mean, we started in January, and we have maybe 5 cases that are ripe for the next step, which is suing the state, but we're only now getting to that phase. And these are cases that have been going on before we even launched the unit, right? So it takes quite some time to get through the process before suing the state.
Yes, and I mean, there's just so much here to continue to talk about, but we are out of time. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Of course, thank you
much.
for being here. And thank you so much for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you.
Bye.